Excellent. Okie dokie. All right, well, we have 10 people in here, which is a little short. I'm not really sure where folks are, but it is 7:45, so I guess I'm going to get started here. I've been waiting for the number to climb up, but it seems to kind of be stuck where it is. So, let's get started. The first thing that I want to mention to you is just as a little bit of a forewarning, we are coming up closer to the end of the unit here. We're not there yet, but we will be soon. And so, just putting the fact that there will be a test coming up next week on your radar, probably on Monday would be my guess. I should be able to get through possibly Wednesday next week. It just depends on how long it takes me to get through the Napoleon PowerPoint, but I'm going to really try and get through most of it today and Friday. So plan for Monday for that test, okay? Plan for Monday. And as it usually goes for the test, there won't be a formal lecture that day. You're going to log in the morning time. The test will be available for you. You'll take the test during your class time on Monday, okay? And there will be, multiple choice section and a writing section of some sort, probably probably an SAQ, but so just make sure that that is on your radar. I have formally warned you that the test is coming up on Monday, so as I say, if it gets postponed, that's one thing, but plan for Monday. Okay. So we are going to continue with today. We were talking about last class the kind of corrupt and self-interested directory, which replaces the National Convention in Paris, which was the government under Maximilien Robespierre. But when Robespierre is beheaded, the National Convention is dissolved, and they hold they go back to the drawing board. They completely come up with a brand new form of government, blueprint for government. I mentioned to you that the directory had those 5 directors, which each operated essentially as presidents who were equal in power with one another. So rather than having a single executive or a single person in a high position in government, like a president or something, they had 5, and this was in part to try to reduce the likelihood that they ended up in another situation where they had another Robespierre at the top of the government and turning into a tyrant and a dictator. So, but unusually, what's really interesting is that actually France, as they're swinging back the other direction from this radical phase to a much more conservative phase of the French Revolution, in fact, they will precisely create the conditions by which Napoleon will come to power. And Napoleon is, I hate to use the word tyrant because he's really not overly tyrannical. Although if you were to ask other people at the time, in Britain or whatever, they definitely would have classified Napoleon as a tyrant because he pretty much tried to take over all of Europe. But the thing about Napoleon is that for the people of France, he was actually pretty good. And so the people of France love Napoleon. Even to this day, Napoleon's like a national hero of France. The Arc de Triomphe is dedicated to Napoleon, right, and his victories. It was built while he was still alive, or it started being built while he was still alive. And so, Napoleon's kind of an interesting guy because he's a noble, but as I mentioned to you before, he grew up in Corsica, which was this small island to the south of France in the Mediterranean, which at the time France controlled. And he's not the kind of noble who was like in the inner workings of all of the first and second estate stuff that was happening prior to the start of the French Revolution. He's not like one of those nobles that was living at Versailles. He's kind of a lesser noble, you know, and he no one, you know, no, it's just kind of from a faraway place and ends up going to military school. And then the last thing that we talked about last class was how he defended the Directory and then was put on assignment to go and lead the French forces in the War of the First Coalition. So he goes off to the Alps and he starts winning a series of victories in the mountains, and then goes all the way down to North Africa, and he gets pinned down by the British Royal Navy there, but no one could defeat him. No one could defeat him on land. He was a military genius, and his moves were so unpredictable and strategic. He completely modernized European warfare, and you know, there's some cool and really interesting facts about Napoleon in terms of like Napoleon. You know, famously, one of the biggest mistakes that Napoleon made was that he went and he invaded Russia, which was not, I mean, it was a bad idea. There was no question it was like a bad idea. But the interesting fact is that actually on horseback in the early 1800s, 18 teens, I guess, 1812, okay? 1812, Napoleon invades Russia. And I don't know if you've looked at a map of Europe recently, but France and Russia are not really that close to one another. It's probably about 1,000 or 1,500 miles. And so he has to march a really long way, but he makes it actually to Moscow faster than when the Nazis invaded Russia in World War II. And the Nazis were coming from Germany. So, you know, and so in other words, they're closer to Russia. So the thing that's really interesting about that is in like a time in like these troops are on horseback, they don't have mechanized warfare yet, as they did in World War II, where you had tanks and you had, you know, armored vehicles, you had half-track vehicles and motorcycles and things like that. You know, the Germans got completely bogged down in the mud and in the dust in Russia because there were no roads, and so or they were only dirt roads, and so it actually took the Nazis longer to make it from Germany to Moscow in 1941 than it did for 41 than it did for Napoleon and his troops to make it to Moscow back in 1812, over 100 years earlier. So Napoleon, you know, that's always an interesting fact because it goes to show Napoleon was a truly brilliant military commander, and there's a lot of jokes made at Napoleon's expense, particularly in British history. I think that perhaps Britain, you know, because the British and the French were fighting against one another, there's a tendency in history when one side comes out victorious, as Britain did at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Britain defeats Napoleon. And because they defeat Napoleon, they kind of write the books about him as being a tyrant, and he becomes the butt of a lot of jokes of he was short and all these kinds of things. But in reality, to be honest, Napoleon was a pretty average size height dude during his day. He wasn't super tall. He was about 5'6", maybe about 5'7", somewhere in that area. Not very tall, but certainly by modern day standards. People grow a lot taller nowadays because our nutrition is a lot better, and prenatal care and other things are a lot better, so people grow a lot taller now. But in those days, it was pretty common for people to have stunted growth as a result of not eating enough or having very limited diets that aren't very diverse. And so he's an average sized dude. He also, Napoleon struggled his entire life with stomach problems, digestive tract problems, and this is kind of gross, but it is true. But he also suffered terribly from something called hemorrhoids. Hemorrhoids, if you're not familiar with that, with what it is, it's a medical condition where for folks who, have bowel issues, you can end up getting like essentially a thrombosed blood vessel in your anus. That's the most medical way that I can put it, and they're very painful. And Napoleon suffered from this tremendously, probably from riding horses too, and other things like that. It doesn't help. So Napoleon had a lot of health problems. Napoleon, a lot of people say, short man complex, that the whole reason that he wanted to conquer Europe was because he somehow felt inferior. And I don't subscribe to that theory. Don't get me wrong, I guess it's possible, but there's no real hard evidence for those kinds of retroactive historical assumptions, outside of a proper psychological diagnosis. They didn't have any of that stuff back then, so it's really hard to retroactively be like, oh, so and so probably had whatever. Isaac Newton, for example, we don't know exactly what his deal is, but he probably was autistic, but it's difficult. You don't know really. And so Napoleon, though, I think was very much driven by a thirst for power. An insatiable thirst for power, actually. So he's a guy who, make no question about it, he deliberately wants to take over Europe. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Unfortunately, it's really unusual. Napoleon's kind of an interesting figure for another reason too, and it relates to nationalism. As we continue to progress throughout this semester, nationalism is really going to be one of those things that you're going to want to keep a pulse on, because nationalism is one of those double-edged swords, particularly for Napoleon. On one hand, nationalism is precisely what allowed Napoleon to be so successful with the French military and his governance as the Emperor of France. He manages to use nationalism as a force of unity to bring people together in the state of France, and the people were extremely loyal to the state of France, but also extremely loyal to Napoleon because they viewed him as being so patriotic and fighting for the nation of France rather than for himself, even though it was kind of for himself. But but the reality of the situation is that nationalism is also what brought Napoleon down. Because, as Napoleon was going across the countryside and conquering all of these different places, the people of those places, take for example, Spain. So in Spain, Napoleon removed the King of Spain and put his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, and I'm not making that up, that was actually Napoleon's brother's name. Joseph Bonaparte became the king of Spain. And immediately the Spanish people are like, we're not French. We're not French. We don't want a French king in Spain. And Napoleon did this in several places, setting up what were called puppet governments. Okay, and if you think about what a puppet is, right? A puppet, you put it on your hand, ventriloquism, right? You're the one speaking for the puppet. Sorry if you thought that they were talking on their own. Sorry to break it to you, but puppets don't speak. It's the person manipulating the puppet that speaks. And so what is a puppet government? It's when Napoleon sets up governments in these other places that he's the one actually governing it, right? It seems like it's autonomous, Okay, it seems like it's running itself, but really he's the one that's in charge. And the reason that he's in charge is because people are so afraid of him. He's got this massive military that's 100% loyal to him. And he uses the military very, very effectively. And so people don't want to upset Napoleon by not going along with what he says, because he'll turn right around and bring his military towards you and conquer you, and you're going to make the situation worse for yourself. So it's just easier to go along to get along. That being said, the people of these places don't feel French. And so when we talk about nationalism, right, precisely one of the things that allows for Napoleon's downfall is that these other European nations, in the name of nationalism, in the name of national pride and protecting their national identity, they resist French rule. They resist Napoleon coming in there and just allowing him to take them over. So nationalism is an interesting thing. It can be something that, I don't know if any of you last year took AP Human Geography, but you guys in AP Human Geography, one of the things that they'll talk to you about in that class, if you end up taking, you can also take it as a senior if you want. One of the things that they'll end up talking to you about that in that class is something called centripetal versus centrifugal forces, or centrifugal forces. And these are physics terms to essentially characterize, is the force pulling something to the center, or is it pushing it out to the edge? Okay, centripetal versus centrifugal force. And so in the case of nationalism, nationalism can go either direction. Nationalism can be a centripetal force, okay, and bring people together, or it can be a centrifugal force, and it can push people away from one another, as was the case in Southeast Europe in a place called Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia wasn't established until after World War I. But after World War I, Yugoslavia gets established. There were a bunch of different kinds of ethnic folks living in Yugoslavia, and eventually nationalism ended up being a force that pushed these people away from one another. They broke away and they ended up establishing independence from each other. And so nationalism during Napoleon's time worked very much the same way. The other thing that you're going to want to recognize is that Napoleon is a rather conservative figure. Okay? He is operating in many ways as an enlightened despot. And that's why in this last little phase of the French Revolution unit, we're now no longer in the age of Rousseau when the Directory collapses. As the Directory collapses, we move into a new phase where essentially we're dealing with what we nickname in this class as the age of Voltaire. Because remember that Voltaire lived with Frederick the Great of Prussia for a time in the 1760s, I think. And I think it was the 1760s, maybe it was the 1750s. But anyhow, Voltaire, if you recall, even though he was one of the most prominent Enlightenment philosophers of that entire movement, he was more or less an advocate of keeping monarchical authority in power, but he thought that the best despot, the best absolute monarch, was one that embraced the teachings of the Enlightenment. And this philosophy is going to characterize Napoleon's rule. He is an enlightened despot. He's a guy who fought for the French Revolution, on the side of the French Revolution. When he comes to power, he keeps many of the changes of the French Revolution. However, he does curtail certain freedoms. It's not complete freedom of speech. There's certain censorship and stuff. Napoleon swings things more conservatively, almost returning back to a similar style of rule as when we had Louis XVI in power, in terms of you've got a single monarch, absolute authority, and so on, except for now it's going to be Napoleon, who is this military leader who has brought glory to France. He's viewed as a hero of France. He's viewed as being an enlightened ruler, and so it's going to be slightly different. The big challenge that Napoleon is going to face is that he's not a legitimate monarch. Okay, he does not have royal lineage. Okay, and so other nations that have legitimate kings in power are going to look at Napoleon as what they call a pretender. Okay, a pretender is somebody who is playing the part of a king but is not actually a king. And so he goes out of his way to legitimize himself, right? He wants to become recognized across Europe as a legitimate monarch, and the rest of these European nations absolutely will not stand for it. So let me start from the beginning with Napoleon here. I've kind of been going on for the last 20 minutes. I didn't mean to, but I think it was a useful what's the word that I'm looking for? Tangent to go on. Let me switch this over to my desktop, and then we can start here with the coup d'etat. This is not pronounced coup d'etat, okay? Mr. Knight, when did the coup d'etat happen? Like, it's coup d'etat Brumaire. The coup d'etat Brumaire. Brumaire is the revolutionary month during the French Revolution. Remember, they changed the calendar. And so in November, that was Brumaire. Okay, Brumaire. So upon returning from Egypt with his forces, Napoleon drove legislators from the Legislative Assembly. He dispersed the crowd with a whiff of grape shot. Okay, I'm sorry, that was previously. That was in his defense of that was my mistake. That was in his defense of the Directory before he left. When he comes back, he runs the coup d'etat, which basically, remember I had told you that he had joined this conspiracy to save the revolution and prevent a royalist return to power under the Directory. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, Abbé Sieyès as he's called, Abbé is his title, like priest, okay? The leader of the conspiracy invited Napoleon to join the conspirators and overthrow Directory, and that is what became known as the coup d'etat Brumaire. Happens in November of 1799. Now, when he overthrows the Directory, okay, it's more or less peaceful. He immediately goes about establishing a new constitution, which began what became known as the Consulate era. When Napoleon first comes to power, he takes the title of First Consul, C-O-N-S-U-L, okay? First Consul. He is not emperor yet. He doesn't become emperor until 1804, or 1804, I believe. Okay, but from 1799 to 1804, the first 5 years of his reign, he's known as First Consul of France. When he writes this constitution, now keep in mind, he's already overthrown the government. Okay, he's already overthrown the government. He writes a constitution, and then he holds what's known as a plebiscite, which is a general referendum. Basically, think of it as like an election, okay? Almost. It's not really an election. You're just holding like a public referendum to see if people approve or disapprove of a policy. Okay, you're not really voting for a person per se. You're more voting to approve or disapprove a policy. And so this plebiscite was overwhelmingly approved by the French population. Now, I always say of this part, you know, this is kind of how this works. It seems a little out of order to me, right? Let me put it to you this way. Let me give you an example. Let's say we were meeting in the classroom. Okay, let's say we were meeting in the classroom. And I said, okay, folks, happy Wednesday morning. You know what? Let's get whatever lunch today. Okay, whatever. It's lunchtime. Okay, let's get lunch. Who wants to order lunch? And then everybody's like, yeah, raising their hand. I want lunch. Let's get this. Let's get that. Okay. That's me asking you, hey, do you want to order food? And then, we would decide what we want or whatever. That seems like the order it should go in. However, the way that Napoleon's thing goes is it would be like this. It'd be like if in the classroom I bought everybody pizza, okay? I didn't even ask you. I just went and bought everyone pizza, okay? And then you guys eat pizza. We get done with lunch. And then I'm like, all right, everybody, who wants pizza for lunch? And then you're like, yeah. Well, we just ate pizza for lunch. So yes, I guess, right? Like that's kind of what this was. Like Napoleon overthrows the government, writes a new constitution, holds a plebiscite, asking people, who wants me to overthrow the government, write a new constitution? And they're like, well, yeah, I guess, because you just did that. You just took over the government. Yeah, right? So anyhow, does that kind of make sense to you? It kind of seems like it comes out of order to me a little bit, right? Anyway, I digress. Okay, so the point is that Napoleon overthrows the government. Here's the coup d'etat Brumaire, all right? And this is just a quick slide to remind you that the anatomy of the French Revolution is Thank you. Yes. So, the anatomy of the revolution is very, very similar to the anatomy of the English Civil War. I just want to remind you of this. Think about this, right? It starts off conservative. You have the old regime. The conservatives and the royalists are in power. They start the revolution with moderates, okay? Radicals end up taking it to the extreme, all right? So if you think about this, this is like old regime. This is pre-storming the Bastille, okay? Then this would be like the early part of the French Revolution with the National Assembly and Legislative Assembly, and then it gets pushed to a really far extreme, okay, where radicals take it to the extreme, and then down here, it swings back the other way, conservative again, okay? Think about, the independence in the English Civil War. The New Model Army under Oliver Cromwell basically became a radical Republican dictatorship under Cromwell's leadership. Same with under Maximilian Robespierre and the Reign of Terror. And then eventually things swing back the other way because things just get so crazy under the Reign of Terror, similar with how things got so crazy under Cromwell. And then eventually they return back to the conservatives in power. After the English Civil War, it was Charles II, the son of the king that they beheaded 15 years earlier or whatever, not quite, maybe 11 years earlier, all right? And then in France, it's the return of an absolute despot in the name of Napoleon, right? Who rules as an enlightened despot, an absolute monarch, essentially, an emperor, okay? So the two end up following if we're thinking of it along the lines of the political spectrum here, they usually start conservative, swing really radical, and then swing back conservative again in the other direction. Okay, so I have this next PowerPoint for you. which I am now going to upload to, because I think I forgot to do that. So let me upload this to the files thing so that you have this available to you. I guess I gotta do this again. Open file location, Napoleonic era. Donde está? Here, let's, why is this not working? Usually. Here we go. All right. So this this PowerPoint is being made available for you right now on Canvas. It'll be in the file or the PowerPoints file thing. So let's talk Napoleon. So Napoleon began his reign as this enlightened despot who instituted numerous significant reforms in France. Eventually, though, his lust for power and conquest led him to overextend his empire, resulting in his ultimate defeat at Waterloo in 1815. Going back to that old school phrase, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? Think about that for a second, because that's a great quote. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that quote very much characterizes many historical figures, mostly men, by the way, throughout history. And Napoleon Bonaparte is not immune from the you know, it's kind of the whole same thing with Lord of the Rings, right? Why do they give it to Bilbo Baggins? Because he, or Frodo rather, okay? Why do they give it to Frodo? Because he's a little hobbit, and, you know, he is less likely to fall victim to the lust of power that the ring provides, right? And the more you have the ring on, the more it corrupts you, okay? That's very much an allegory for power in political and military positions, right? The longer you're in those positions, there's this corruptive, naturally corruptive factor that makes people seemingly want more of it. And Napoleon in particular had this just insatiable thirst to take more places over that really he would not have benefited from taking over. So we are now in the final third of this unit, okay? You can see that this PowerPoint is a bit shorter than the other one, so it probably won't take me as much time to get through it. But we're in the age of Voltaire, the Napoleonic, first the Consulate era, and then the Napoleonic Empire from 1804 to 1815. So, Napoleon Bonaparte was born of Italian descent to a Corsican family on the French island of Corsica. He is a military genius who specializes in artillery. As I mentioned to you last class, artillery is that segment of your military that is focused on cannon fire. It's focused on guns and distance-ranged weapons. All right. He was an avid child of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. During the revolutionary years, he was associated with the Jacobins and very much advanced rapidly in the army due to the emigration of the other aristocratic officers outside of France. And so, being that he was kind of a dude that came in from the outside, he wasn't super well known. People didn't hate him the way that some of these other aristocratic officers, who likely were very hated by many of the bourgeois class during the start of the revolution, fled the nation. Napoleon, it opens opportunities for him to serve. And so eventually he inspired a very divided nation during the Directory phase into a united nation, but very much at the price of individual liberty. As I said, although Napoleon is an enlightened despot, he also understands that there's a careful balance that needs to be maintained between liberty and order. Okay? Too much freedom can be a bad thing, because too much freedom could result in mob rule, it could result in general strikes, it could result in chaos and disarray. Napoleon is trying to come to power to bring stability, okay, to the nation of France. So, the Consulate Period. This was in many ways, the earliest part of Napoleon's career is his most successful part of his career. Kind of the longer and more, the longer that the years go by and the more, what's the word that I'm looking for? The more driven, I guess, or more motivated that Napoleon becomes to consolidate his power across the entire continent of Europe, the less successful he becomes. So, the Consulate Period, as first consul, he behaved more as an absolute ruler than a revolutionary statesman. He demanded loyalty to the state. One of the things that's really interesting about Napoleon is that he established a more or less meritocratic system. When we think about meritocracy, meritocracy is this, it's this, type of principle that people are promoted and given jobs and so on based on their ability, rather than just on who they're connected to, who they know, who their father is, etc. Okay? And so what Napoleon does very early with the military, for example, is he starts promoting people in his military based on how good they are at their jobs. Whereas before, there were a lot of other corruptive influences that saw people who, just because they were related to a politician or they were the son of a different general or whatever else, but weren't really that good at their job, found their way many times into higher ranking positions in the military. After all, it was only nobles who could serve as officers for most of the time that we've been learning about European history throughout the year. So with the exception of, I think, Frederick the Great of Prussia does do a little bit of meritocratic promotions too, but Napoleon really normalizes rewarding ability, okay, giving people jobs and promotions and so on based on how good they are at their job, their ability, their talents, and so on. And he created an effective hierarchical bureaucracy, a state bureaucracy. Remember going back to learning about absolutism, which very much relied on various systems, bureaucratic systems with kind of webs of different people in a hierarchy where, we talked about before, just like if you call up Microsoft because you have a problem with Windows, okay, you're not going to be put through to Bill Gates. You're going to be put through to, I don't even know if Bill Gates owns Microsoft anymore, to be honest with you, but the point is to say that they're going to put you through to a call center, probably in Indonesia or something, and then, if they can't resolve it, then you get transferred to the supervisor, okay, and then if they can't handle it, then you get transferred to the regional manager or whatever, okay. There's this whole system of bureaucracy and ranks, and Napoleon sets up similar kinds of systems in France, where he sets up a much more cohesive legal code called the Napoleonic Code, and a much more comprehensive judicial system where the state was functioning as a whole rather than as a bunch of divided departments. Reforms. Napoleonic Code, the first clear and complete codification of French law. It's perhaps the longest lasting legacy of Napoleon's rule, because the Napoleonic Code contained a civil code, a code of criminal procedure, a commercial code, and a penal code. Okay, and we have very much similar codes in our own structure of laws. There's criminal court cases, there's civil court cases, there's federal crimes, and there's state crimes, and so on and so forth. Okay, and when we talk about these things, the reason that it's so important to have your laws codified, it draws upon an ancient practice that comes from ancient Rome. Ancient Rome, in ancient Rome, one of the first times that laws were written down and displayed in public was with what was known as the 12 Tables. And the 12 Tables outlined these basic laws of the Roman Empire, or rather Roman Republic. I think it happened before Julius Caesar, but the point being that these laws were written down, they were displayed publicly for people to know. And the reason that that's so important is because we want the law to work the same for everyone. It shouldn't matter where you come from. It shouldn't matter how much money you have. It shouldn't matter if you're famous, or if you're the president, or if you're a poor person living under a bridge, or whatever. Okay, the law should work the exact same way for everyone, because the whole thing about justice is that justice is supposed to be, to the best extent of our ability, blind, meaning that it shouldn't be prejudicial. One person shouldn't get their hands chopped off for stealing and then another person get a slap on the wrist. Okay, that's unfair. That's not punishing people for breaking the law in the same way. And so, you can't just, that's why there's certain sentences for certain crimes. You're not going to be sentenced to life in prison if you steal, okay? That's not a reasonable sentence for somebody who steals. Stealing is just property, you're not harming anyone, okay? The only way that you would be able to get life in prison is if you took someone else's life, and the law is supposed to work in a way in which you have equal punishments for equal crimes. Okay, this is one of the ideas that Napoleon brings to France, and it sticks around for a very long time. Many achievements of the revolution were made permanent. So equality before the law, freedom. And by the way, I just want to make sure that I mention to you that although I say that the law, justice is supposed to be blind. In other words, the law should not be prejudicial. That is not stating my position of the current system. I think that if we go back to the preamble of the Constitution, right, which says that we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, that is literally the first few words of the Constitution. Okay, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. And I want you to think about that. What is a more perfect union? It's one that is not yet perfect. Okay, it's always striving to be more perfect. And so with our current judicial system, with our current criminal justice system, there are, unfortunately, it's hard to make it equal. It's not perfect yet, okay? And we will need to continue to strive to do what the Constitution says and make a more perfect union, make a more perfect country, make a more perfect criminal justice system. But we do see unfairness happen. We do see wrong convictions happen. We do see people targeted by the laws, and it should be our goal as a society to try to rectify those inequities, right? So anyhow, but that's just my position. If you think that we have a perfect criminal justice system as we are now, I think that probably I could present you some evidence that would at least shake the foundation of your thoughts, but that's just my thoughts on it, and you're entitled to your own as well. So the state was secular in character. Of course, they're trying to reduce the role of the church in the state. Property rights were guaranteed. They completely had abolished serfdom, even though, to be honest with you, serfdom really didn't exist that many places by this point in France anyway, but at least it's officially abolished. And he also gave women inheritance rights, which they had kind of temporarily gotten at one point during the French Revolution, but remember that in many ways, under the Directory, women were encouraged to kind of return to this cult of domesticity and be working in the home. Now, the other thing about this is that although he gave women inheritance rights, women were absolutely denied equal status with men in society. Okay, women and children were very legally dependent on their husband or father. Divorce was actually harder to obtain under Napoleon than during the Revolution. Women were not able to buy or sell property or start a business without their husband's consent. So we do still see a lot of pretty oppressive social and legal practices against women that subjugate them to a second-class role in society, which of course is not the way that it is today in France, but at this time we're still in the early 1800s, and we have a long ways yet before we get to women's suffrage and stuff like that. We're about a century away from women's suffrage. In other words, women being able to vote. Suffrage, in case you've ever wondered what that word is, it's just voting rights. It doesn't have anything to do with suffering. Okay. So let's see here. Women could not buy or sell property. I said that one. Income earned by wives went to their husbands, and then penalties for adultery were far more severe for women than they were for men. Okay, careers open to talent. This is that meritocratic, or I don't know if that's the right word, but meritocratic system that I was talking about before. Citizens theoretically across France, and I do mean mostly men, were able to rise in government service purely according to their abilities. However, a new imperial nobility was created to reward the most talented generals and officials. Wealth very much determines status at this time, just as it does today. One of the things that Napoleon does do is he tries to crack down on corruption. Okay. One of the things that was pretty commonplace in France is that people, thanks to certain political connections, economic connections, wealth ties, and other things like that, used to be able to buy or sell offices and improve their rank in government. Also, there were corruptive influences when people got into those places. There was a lot of what's called cronyism, which is where you take and you bring all your buddies in and put them into positions of power. Famously, we've had presidents do this in the past, including most recently President Trump had taken a bunch of people who he was friends with in the private sector and put them into positions of power and stuff. And he's not the first president that's done that, and he certainly won't be the last. But the idea basically being here that he's trying to cut down on governmental corruption. The other thing about careers open to talent is that he granted amnesty to about 100,000 émigrés in return for a loyalty oath. So in other words, he invites the French nobles, 100,000 of them, which is a pretty significant number of people who had been living outside of France in various countries as the revolution was going on. They were allowed to come back so long as they swore an oath to Napoleon, and many of those same émigrés ended up occupying high posts in the expanding state structure. So some nobles from foreign countries even served the empire with distinction. And that's another thing that's pretty unusual is, the fact that at least in the early days, we're still in the very early consulate period before he was trying to take over the entire continent, some other nobles from foreign countries served the French Empire. The working class movement, e.g. the sans-culottes, was no longer politically significant by this time. Really, even by the Directory's time, the sans-culottes had been, their influence had been stripped away, and workers were denied the right to form trade unions. Religious reforms, the Concordat of 1801 with the Roman Catholic Church. This is something that I've had a few kids ask me about. What is the Concordat of 1801? Napoleon had a pulse on the public sentiment. Okay, he had a pulse on the public sentiment, and he knew that people's religious beliefs were very, very important to them. And so, as a result of this, he basically invites the church back into France. However, when he does so, he is making sure to keep the Roman Catholic Church's influence subordinate to his influence, okay? He wants to invite the church back, welcome the French peasant population to worship freely, okay? His motive for inviting the church back was that making peace with the Pope in Rome would weaken the Pope's link to monarchists who wanted to put the Bourbon dynasty, Louis XVI's family, back into power. And so there were monarchical figures across Europe, of course, who absolutely reject Napoleon's takeover of France. They want to see a legitimate royal bloodline of the Bourbon dynasty back in power. But by making friends with the church and inviting the Pope into France, okay, he thought that doing so would gain him the support of the people. Okay, religion would help people accept some of these, invariable economic inequalities in French society. Okay, provisions. Papacy renounced claims over church property seized during revolution. In other words, okay, one of the provisions of the Concordat, which was an agreement to invite basically the Roman Catholic Church back into France, is that the papacy had to give up any claims that it had over church property that had been seized during the revolution. In other words, Napoleon made it very clear from the start, you're not getting that church property back, okay? You can come, people are able to worship the Roman Catholic Church, et cetera, but you're not getting the land back. The French government retained the power to nominate or depose bishops. And in return, priests who had resisted the civil constitution of the clergy would replace those who had sworn an oath to the state. Okay, so he was putting in that refractory clergy, all right, and the Pope had to give up claims to church lands in France. The Catholic Church, okay, was welcomed back, and worship in public was once again restored. Remember that under Maximilien Robespierre, he had outlawed Christianity, and so people were not allowed to worship in public. Church seminaries were reopened. He extended legal toleration to Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and atheists, who all received the same civil rights. So we do see a protection of the freedom of religion, which was one of Voltaire's most famous contributions to the Enlightenment, was that he wanted people to have freedom of religion and subdue the power of religion to the state. And this is very much the system that Napoleon sets up with the Concordat of 1801. Now, to dispel the notion of an established church, Napoleon put Protestant ministers of all denominations on the state payroll. In other words, he didn't want to invite the church back and make it seem like he was restoring, divine right and a French Catholic established church. And so what he does is he takes people of all different backgrounds of faith and puts them into positions of authority and on the state payroll. And by doing so, he's basically saying it doesn't matter what faith you subscribe to. Everybody in this state has an equal chance or a fair shake at serving the state. The state was the supreme apparatus, not the church. Financial unity. One of the most important economic changes that Napoleon made to France was he initiated the Bank of France. which really was a long time coming. France had really would have benefited from a national bank being established about 100 years before the French Revolution broke out, around the same time that Britain did. Remember that the Bank of England was established just at the end of the 1600s, right before England turns into Great Britain. And the Bank of France doesn't get established until Napoleon in the early 1800s. So France is about a century behind in terms of establishing a national bank the way that the British did, as well as the way that the Dutch Republic did even before the English. So the government began balancing the budget. The Bank of France served the needs of the state and the financial oligarchy that kept the budget afloat, as well as providing for sound currency, in other words, money that wasn't going to lose its value, and public credit. In other words, the nation of France would, be able to take out essentially debt against itself, which it would then pay back through either, bonds or through future tax revenue collected from the citizens. Economic reforms stimulated the economy. He encouraged low food prices, low unemployment rates. He lowered taxes on farmers. Peasants were able to retain those lands that they had taken and in many cases purchased from the state of France during the earlier part of the revolution. After the civil constitution, the clergy started using assignats as currency. And remember that those assignats, their value had been guaranteed by the sale of church lands to various peasants. And so those peasants were able to hold on to those lands, and that created kind of a nice opportunity for a lot of peasants under Napoleon to establish independent farms. So many people were able to become successful, what are known as yeoman farmers. Y-E-O-M, yeoman? Yeoman. It's spelled like this, yeoman. Yeoman farmers, I believe, is how it's is spelled. Okay, yeoman farmers are farmers who own their own land and make their own living on their own land, rather than being a tenant farmer, which means that you are a tenant on the land that is not yours and you pay rent to live there. Also, Napoleon created an independent peasantry that would become the backbone of the French democracy. Tax collections became more efficient. Workers, though, were still not allowed to form guilds or trade unions because this was seen as something that could be used as a potential weapon against the economic viability of France. So Napoleon does keep the Le Chapelier law in place that had been passed back during the Legislative Assembly years in 1791. Educational reforms. He instituted a number of educational reforms that were based on a system of public education, which is another kind of new thing for the 1800s. Really, to be honest with you, America was really the one who paved the way for public education becoming a more commonplace thing. Remember that going back to the years of the Age of Absolutism in the 1600s and 1700s, that to obtain an education pretty much meant that you had to be extremely wealthy or a noble, okay? And because that's the only way that you ever would have been able to afford an education, because educations were not provided by the state. You had to pay a private education, or a private university rather, to get an education. Starting with Napoleon, though, in France, and then increasingly across Europe as the century goes on, the 1800s move onwards, we see more public schools, and also even by the time that we get to the late 1800s, a number of laws passed that actually mandate that students obtain an education in their youth. And so now Napoleon doesn't create that yet, but he does set up public lycees, okay? So rigorous standards were available to the masses. Secondary and higher education, called lycees, were reorganized to prepare young men for government jobs and professional occupations. So you would attend these lycees, and he also created basically state exams. So, for example, when I became a teacher, I had to take, well, I mean, throughout my entire education, I've had to take a million different standardized tests, right? Exams that demonstrate my competence as, as an academic. So, for example, when you go to college, when you guys become, when you get into your junior and senior years, you're going to start looking at applying for colleges, and you may end up having to take tests like the SAT or whatever to determine your placement. For higher level professions, when I became a teacher, I had to take a state teacher exam, essentially, called the CSET, which is a test on history that you take after you get your bachelor's degree to make sure that you actually, learned history. And, of course, because I'm a teacher, I passed it, good news. But there are other ways that there are other tests that are similar. If you wanted to become a diplomat for the government, for example, you would have to take something called the Foreign Service exam and demonstrate it. If you wanted to become a lawyer, you have to take a state exam called the bar. Okay, if you want to become a medical doctor, you have to take various numbers of tests to do that. Okay, MCAT and all, not MCAT. What's the word that I'm looking for? There's all sorts of, I forget the names of them. But anyway, the point being that these standardized tests were something that Napoleon introduced. And so in order to serve in public office, you had to pass these standardized tests, go through these lycees, and demonstrate that you were a competent official, okay? Napoleon sought to increase the size of the middle class of France because he knew that by giving people more opportunities, this would overall, a rising tide lifts all ships, as they say. And so when everybody has more money, when everybody is given more opportunities, it helps everybody else out as well. Now, Napoleon is not just going to let freedom run free to the point of chaos. He basically does create a police state. He had a vast system of spies that kept thousands of citizens under continuous surveillance for seditious activity. Seditious means going against the government. And so after 1810, when Napoleon's power is starting to kind of slip between his fingers a little bit, political suspects start to be held in state prisons the same way that they had been during the Reign of Terror. And the government under Napoleon really ruthlessly put down any opposition, particularly, though, a group of guerrilla warfare fighters in the West, in the provinces of the Vendée and Brittany. These two regions of France are notoriously very independent and culturally view themselves as being French, but not the same as all other French people. France, remember, goes back a long time in history, and for a long time there were a lot of distant regions in France that retained some local pride, local autonomy. And under Napoleon, he's not going to allow these groups in distant regions to be a threat to the stability of the order of the state. So anyhow, and I'll move on here. Drawbacks of Napoleon's reforms, of course, are that you have, number one, severe inequality for women. We can't really say that Napoleon did much to help women out of France. Workers, of course, not being allowed to form trade unions means that they have a difficult time collectively bargaining for better working conditions, better pay, things like that. Liberty and republicanism are no doubt repressed. Censorship was reinstated. The use of secret police to spy on people and other things like that doesn't exactly scream an absolutely free society. Nonetheless, he's doing it in the name of maintaining order. The other thing is that Napoleon himself practiced nepotism, which is of course a form of corruption, by placing his own family members on the thrones of nations he conquered. And I already gave you the example of Joseph Bonaparte becoming the king of Spain thanks to Napoleon conquering Spain. But Napoleon is, at the end of the day, nonetheless instituting a number of very modern reforms in France that are going to help France to become quite a significant power in Europe for the next, several decades, minimally. Napoleonic Wars during the Consulate era. Okay, so many of the wars of the Napoleonic era are short and distinct. Really, the only nation that is at war with France continually throughout this time is going to be Britain. Remember that Napoleon is a land military leader. He's not a naval military leader. So because his speciality is on land troops, okay, it's going to make it really difficult for Napoleon to conquer Britain, because Britain, of course, is an island. And because Britain is an island, that means that you have to take ships to get there. And the thorn that will remain perpetually in Napoleon's side throughout pretty much his entire career as the head of state of France is going to be the British Royal Navy. The British Royal Navy refuses to allow Napoleon to just reign free, and they will pose significant challenges to him at various points throughout his career, as they already had done back when he got pinned down at the Battle of the Nile in 1798, before he even took over the government. The four great powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, really don't come back together to fight simultaneously with one another against France until 1813, right towards the end of Napoleon's reign. And these nations allied with France in the times before that to benefit their own selves. Okay, many of these nations willfully became puppet governments of Napoleon precisely because they didn't want Napoleon bringing his military in there and slapping them around. And so, the French conquest of Italy does happen to alienate some of these foreign powers, but nonetheless, he's able to maintain pretty decent control for at least a short period of time. So, the War of the Second Coalition. Remember, the first coalition was the one that happened during the early part of the French Revolution. We are now in what's known as the War of the Second Coalition from 1798 to 1801. This is when, at the Battle of the Nile in 1798, Britain's Horatio Nelson, who's pictured right here in this PowerPoint on the side, managed to successfully defeat Napoleon's navy. Now, Napoleon does emerge victorious in the War of the Second Coalition despite losing this battle. But the British Royal Navy is going to continue to try to thwart Napoleon's efforts. The Treaty of Luneville was passed in 1801, which officially ended the Second Coalition War. Austria had lost its Italian possessions at that time. The German territory west of the Rhine River was incorporated into France, that territory known as the Rhineland, and Russia retreated from Western Europe due to British threats in the Mediterranean. And here we can see a British cartoon commenting on the Battle of the Nile, and here you see Horatio Nelson, who, by the way, was missing both an arm and an eye, okay? So he was, kind of quite a character, a sight for sore eyes. But anyway, there's some joke about how does it go? What was it? How does it go? Did you hear Horatio Nelson lost his eye and lost his arm? Yeah, he's all right now. okay, referring to, the fact that he lost, I think it was actually his left eye and his left arm that he maintained. But anyway, it doesn't really make any difference. The point being that this is him beating down the French crocodiles, which are colored with the tricolore, which is the colors of the flag of France, red, white, and blue, the bars. Okay, so it's a bunch of crocodiles, and here's Napoleon, submitting all of these sea creatures, or not Napoleon, Horatio Nelson rather, submitting all these sea creatures in the Battle of the Nile. So there was this interim peace. It was called the Treaty of Amiens. The Treaty of Amiens with Britain temporarily suspended war between Britain and France in 1802, but the British remained ready at all times to go back to war with France. And during this time, Napoleon reorganized the Confederation of Switzerland, turned Switzerland into a puppet government. And Napoleon also, incidentally, tried to reinstate slavery in Haiti, and that does not go over well because Haiti had already run a successful revolt. And when Napoleon tries to reinstate slavery in Haiti, the Haitian former slaves, of course, completely reject this. They stage a successful 12-year revolt that ultimately ended in 1803. And Napoleon, when he realizes they're not going to get control of Haiti, he gives up his ambitions to create a colonial empire in the New World for France, and instead focuses all of his efforts on conquering Europe, which during his time was really the forefront of the world anyway. The New World, America, even though France helped America in the American Revolution, America was still considered by most folks in Europe to be a very faraway land, a very backwoods, weird place where a bunch of gun-toting crazies were living. And so, and America in their early days is beyond weak. That we do not have a powerful military. France would have come over and really posed a challenge to us, navally and otherwise at this time. So, America is really treading carefully on thin ice with France and Britain at this time. And once Haiti is lost to Napoleon, he basically turns to America. France had a number of huge swaths of territory that were technically their possessions at the time, and Napoleon basically says to America, "Hey, we'll sell you the Louisiana Purchase for $15 million." And Thomas Jefferson, who was the president at the time, is absolutely salivating. He's so excited about getting this huge territory in the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon. So Thomas Jefferson purchases the Louisiana territory from Napoleon, and this also helps to cool down tensions internationally between America and Europe. Okay, I am going to leave off the PowerPoint there for today. We will pick it up next time, and so yeah, we'll pick it up then, and see you soon. See you on Friday.